The lawyer's office smelled like fresh coffee and old paper, and I remember thinking that was strange, because nothing about that morning should have smelled normal. My father sat at the head of the conference table like he still owned every chair in the room, and when Howard Pruitt slid the folder across the table toward me, my father's hand came down on top of mine before I could touch it. "Not yet," he said. "Not until this is settled." Settled. That was the word he used, like my mother's death was an invoice waiting on a signature. 6 people sat around that table. My brother Eric, our family attorney, my Aunt Connie, 2 cousins who'd flown in for the funeral and stayed for the money. And every one of them watched my father look at me the way you'd look at someone you suspected of stealing from a register. "Walter," Howard said carefully, "the trust names Sarah as an equal beneficiary. There's no provision. There's the negligence clause," my father said. "Page 11. You wrote it yourself. I want you to remember that word, negligence, because in about 11 days, that word was going to belong to someone else in that room, and it wasn't going to be me." Here's the detail that didn't make sense yet, the one I didn't understand until much later. My father kept glancing at the wall behind Howard's desk, where there was nothing but a generic landscape painting and a small dome camera blinking its quiet red light near the ceiling. He wasn't looking at me when he accused me. He was looking at that camera like it might say something he didn't want said. It would, just not yet. "My name is Sarah Calloway. I'm 34 years old. I work as a forensic accountant. And for 6 months before my mother died, I was the only person in my family who showed up to Briarcliff General Hospital more than twice a week. I want to tell you how my own father stood in front of our family lawyer and accused me of killing my mother through neglect, how he froze my share of a trust worth almost $2 million to protect the estate from liability, and how a hospital security server with 11 days left before automatic deletion ended up telling the truth he never thought anyone would ask to hear. To understand why that accusation cut as deep as it did, you have to understand what my father was to me before all of this. Walter Calloway built Calloway Veneer and Furniture from a single rented warehouse in Eastfield, Ohio, into a business that supplied custom cabinetry to half the state. He was proud, exact, and almost never wrong in his own mind. Growing up, I learned the difference between my father's love and my brother Eric's love by watching where my father's attention went. Eric got the company titles. Eric got taken to trade shows. Eric got "you'll run this place someday" before he'd even finished community college. I got report cards taped to the refrigerator and a quiet nod if I made the honor roll. My mother, Diane, was the one who made sure I never felt like an afterthought. She was the one who drove 4 hours to my college graduation alone because my father had a shipment to oversee. She was the one who called me every Sunday night just to talk about nothing. What I'd had for dinner, whether I'd watered the plant on my windowsill, whether the man from accounting I'd mentioned once had texted back. I remember one specific Sunday, the winter I turned 26, when I'd been laid off from my first accounting job and was too embarrassed to tell my father. My mother drove 90 minutes in a snowstorm just to sit in my apartment kitchen and tell me, calmly, that I'd find something better within the year. I did, 8 months later, at a firm that paid almost twice as much. She never once mentioned it to my father. It was ours, a small private fact she kept like a coin in her pocket. When she got sick, ovarian cancer, stage 3, diagnosed the spring I turned 33, she asked me, not Eric, not my father, to be her healthcare power of attorney. "You ask the right questions," she told me in the kitchen, holding a mug of tea she could barely finish. "Your father hears what he wants to hear. Eric just agrees with him. I need someone who reads the paperwork." I read the paperwork. For 8 months, I read every paperwork there was. I sat through 3 different oncologists, 2 clinical trial consent forms, and one very long argument with an insurance company about a denied claim that I eventually won by finding a clause buried on page 40 of a policy nobody else had bothered to open. My father visited the hospital when it was convenient, usually with flowers, always with an apology for staying only 20 minutes, because the Hendrickson order needed his eye. I was there for hour 11 of a 14-hour wait when my mother came out of her hip revision surgery in March, the surgery that was supposed to fix the fracture from a fall in her own bathroom and get her strong enough for the next round of treatment. That surgery is where this story really starts. My mother was recovering in room 412 of Briarcliff General. The fall had broken her hip in a spot the surgeons called unfortunate, which is doctor language for expensive and slow to heal. She was on a strict fall precaution protocol. Side rails up at all times, a bed alarm that triggered if she shifted weight wrong, a call light she was under strict instruction not to leave the bed without using first. I knew this because I was the one who signed the precaution acknowledgement form. I still have a photo of it on my phone, dated and time-stamped, because that's the kind of person I am. I document things. It's the same habit that makes me good at my job and apparently insufferable at family dinners. For the first 10 days after surgery, everything followed the plan. I came on weekday evenings after work. Eric came twice for about 20 minutes each time, mostly to ask the nurses when she'd be back to normal. My father came on weekends, except for one Tuesday night that I almost didn't think twice about, because at the time it seemed like nothing. It was the Tuesday before she fell again. The fall that killed her. I wasn't there that night. I had a deposition prep call for a client case that ran until almost 10. When I texted my mother to check in, she didn't answer right away, which wasn't unusual. She slept early on pain medication. What I didn't know, what nobody told me until much later, was that my father had visited that night, alone for almost 90 minutes, and that a nurse named Patty Nguyen had documented in her shift notes that the bed's side rail on the window side was found lowered when she came in to check vitals at 9:40. Nobody mentioned that note to me. Not then. 3 days after that Tuesday, on a Friday morning, my mother fell trying to reach a water pitcher on a rolling table that had been pushed slightly too far from the bed. The fall reopened complications from the hip surgery and triggered a cascade, a blood clot 2 days later, a stroke the following week, and a slow decline that ended with her passing on the 17th of April, surrounded by Eric, my father, and me, holding her hand in a room that no longer needed a fall precaution sign on the door. Grief does strange things to a family. It either pulls people closer or it gives them permission to say things they'd been holding back for years. In my family, it was the second one. At the funeral reception, my father pulled me aside near the coat closet, away from the other guests, and said something I've turned over in my head more times than I can count. "You were her medical proxy," he said. "You were supposed to be watching." I told him I was there as much as anyone, more than anyone, and that the hospital had its own protocols for a reason. He didn't argue with me that day. He just looked at me the way you look at a number that doesn't add up on a balance sheet, like something was owed and he intended to collect it. 2 weeks later, Howard Pruitt called a meeting to formalize the trust distribution. That's the meeting I started this story with. The one where my father put his hand over the folder meant for me and said the word negligence in front of everyone we both loved. What I didn't know yet was that page 11 of the trust, the clause my father quoted, didn't actually say what he claimed it said. It gave the trustee, my father, discretion to delay a distribution pending resolution of any active investigation materially affecting the estate's financial position. There was no active investigation, not one that Howard Pruitt, or the hospital, or anyone official had opened. My father had manufactured one out of a private letter he'd sent to Briarcliff General's Risk Management Department 4 days after the funeral, requesting a formal review into possible inadequate caregiver oversight contributing to patient injury. He named me in that letter. Not the nurses, not himself, me. I found that out from a woman named Karen Voss, the hospital's risk manager, 3 weeks after the will reading, when I called to formally request my mother's complete medical and incident records as her named healthcare proxy. Karen was kind on the phone, the kind of careful kind that comes from someone who's dealt with grieving families enough times to know how to soften bad news. "There is an open file," she told me. "Your father's letter prompted an internal review. I have to tell you, Miss Calloway, your name does appear in the initial complaint." I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for almost 20 minutes after that call, not crying, just doing what I do when I'm trying not to feel something too big. I made a list. I wrote down every date I had visited my mother, every hour, every text message timestamp. I am, by profession and by temperament, someone who builds a case out of paper, and somewhere in that parking lot, the accountant in me quietly decided that if my father wanted to talk about evidence, I would become very, very interested in evidence too. I requested the full incident report under HIPAA, using my still valid proxy authorization, which technically extended to records related to the circumstances of her death, since I had been her designated representative. Karen Voss told me it would take 10 business days. I used those 10 days to start asking questions nobody in my family wanted me to ask. I called Patty Nguyen, the nurse whose name appeared in the shift log Karen had mentioned in passing. She was hesitant at first. Nurses are trained to be careful about what they say to family members after a death, but I wasn't asking her to break confidentiality. I was asking her to confirm something that was already written down. "There's a note from the Tuesday before the fall," she said quietly. "The side rail was down when I did my 9:40 check. I logged it. I also logged that a visitor had been in the room earlier that evening. Your father signed in at the front desk at 7:15 and signed out at 8:50. 7:15 to 8:50. 95 minutes. Alone with my mother, 3 days before the fall that started the chain of events that killed her. That was the first thread. It wasn't proof of anything by itself. People lower rails by accident. People forget to put them back up. But it was a thread, and threads, in my line of work, are how you find the seam that unravels the whole story. The second thread came from something almost embarrassingly mundane. A credit card statement. While going through some of my mother's old paperwork to settle a small personal account, I found a billing folder she kept for the company, an old habit from years ago when she used to help with the books before my father hired an outside accountant. Tucked behind a stack of receipts was a printed bank statement for an account I didn't recognize, a business line of credit opened 8 months earlier, drawn against the Callaway Veneer and Furniture Company's accounts receivable, $240,000. Almost all of it withdrawn in a single transfer in February, the same month my mother's cancer treatment costs had spiked, and the same month the trust's quarterly statement, which I, as a beneficiary, was legally entitled to review, showed a sudden and unexplained dip in liquid assets. I am, again, an accountant. I know what a healthy business loan looks like, and I know what a man quietly bleeding his company dry to cover something else looks like. This looked like the second one. I didn't say anything yet. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like I marched straight into my father's office with a folder and slapped it on his desk. That's not what happened. What happened is I sat on it. I went to my mother's memorial 6-month gathering, where my Aunt Connie wouldn't quite meet my eyes anymore, where a family friend named Sue Halloran asked me, with the particular gentleness people use when they've already decided you're guilty, "How are you holding up, given everything? Given everything?" As if I'd done something that needed forgiving. Eric, my brother, called me once during that stretch, late on a Sunday night, his voice thick in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. "Dad says the hospital review is almost done," he said. "He says it doesn't look good for you, Sarah. Maybe just let the trust thing go for now. Don't make this worse." "Worse for who?" I asked him, and he didn't answer that. He just said goodnight and hung up. A week after that call, Howard's office sent a letter, signed by my father as trustee, formally notifying me that distribution of my share would be held in abeyance until the hospital review concluded. No timeline, no estimate, just a sentence on letterhead that made 2 years of caregiving feel like it had been erased and replaced with a question mark. I want you to sit with that moment, because that was the lowest point of this whole thing for me. My father had taken a story about my mother's death and rewritten me into the villain of it, using a clause from a document he controlled, in front of a family that had decided believing him was easier than asking questions. I had no title, no company, no trust fund yet, and now apparently no benefit of the doubt either. There was a smaller moment around that same time that I almost left out of this story, because it seemed too minor to matter, except it didn't feel minor at all when it happened. My Aunt Connie hosted a small gathering at her house, 6 months after the funeral, mostly old friends of my mother's swapping stories over coffee. I brought a photo album my mother had kept of the two of us, thinking people might want to see it. Connie thanked me for bringing it, set it on the side table, and never opened it once the whole afternoon. Later in the kitchen, I overheard her telling Sue Halloran, in the careful half-whisper people use when they think a closed door is the same as privacy, that she just couldn't reconcile the Sarah she knew with what Walter had described. Nobody had shown her a single piece of paper. She'd simply chosen the version of the story that required the least discomfort. And in that moment, standing in a kitchen that used to feel like a second home to me, I understood exactly how alone I actually was. If you've ever been the one person in a room insisting on the truth while everyone else has already agreed on a simpler story, you know exactly how heavy that kind of quiet gets. But I had something my father didn't account for. I had Karen Voss's 10-day promise, and I had a hospital's own incident reporting policy, which, as I learned from a friend who works in healthcare compliance, requires that any unit where a reportable fall occurs retain corridor and nursing station security footage for a minimum window tied to the internal review, not the standard 30-day rolling deletion. Because my father's letter had triggered an official review, the footage from that wing, including the Tuesday night in question, had been preserved on a separate server specifically because of the complaint he filed. He had built the trap that was going to catch him. When the 10 business days passed, Karen Voss called me into her office at Briarcliff General with a folder thicker than I expected. She slid it across the table the same way Howard Pruitt had slid that other folder weeks earlier, except this time nobody's hand came down to stop me from touching it. Inside was the full incident report, the visitor log printouts, and a written summary describing footage retained from the 4th-floor nursing station camera, the one with a partial view into room 412 through the open door, standard for fall-risk patients. Karen explained that hospital legal counsel had reviewed it as part of the internal process, and that per policy, I was entitled to a summary and a viewing appointment since I was named both as the proxy of record and as a subject of the original complaint. 2 days later, I sat in a small viewing room with Karen, a hospital attorney named Diane Forsyth, a different Diane than my mother, which felt like an odd small mercy, and a legal pad I'd brought out of habit. Before they played anything, Diane Forsyth explained the chain of custody, how the footage had been pulled from the unit's server within 48 hours of my father's complaint and preserved under the hospital's litigation hold policy, which meant nobody could claim later that it had been altered or selectively edited. I asked her to repeat that twice, not because I doubted her, but because some part of me needed to hear, out loud, that this piece of proof couldn't be argued away the same way my father had argued away everything else for the past 2 months. The footage was grainy, time-stamped in the corner, exactly as Patty Nguyen had described. 7:15, my father walks into frame, signs the visitor log just out of camera range, enters room 412. 8:10, he can be seen through the open door, standing at the side of the bed. He reaches down. The rail comes down with him. He doesn't put it back up. At 8:40, he's seated in the corner chair, phone to his ear, gesturing the way he does when he's annoyed, a habit I'd recognized my whole life. 8:50, he leaves. The rail stays down. That alone might have stayed a private, quiet shame, something he could have explained away as forgetfulness, if it weren't for what came next in that same file. 3 days later, the morning of the actual fall, the nursing station log showed the call light in room 412 activating at 6:58 a.m. and not being answered for 11 minutes due to short staffing on a shift change, a separate institutional failure that had nothing to do with me or my father directly. But it was the timeline stitched together. The lowered rail my father left 3 days earlier, never reported, never corrected by the next nurse who assumed standard precautions remained in place because no one had flagged a change that the hospital's own internal review ultimately identified as a contributing factor. Not me, not my visiting hours. A side rail my father lowered and never mentioned to a single nurse, a single doctor, or a single member of his own family, including the daughter he then accused of negligence in a room full of people 3 weeks later. There was one more thing in that file, the detail that turned this from a sad story about an accident into something else entirely. Diane Forsyth, the hospital attorney, had pulled the visitor log cross-referenced with phone records subpoenaed as a standard part of the internal liability review, since my father's complaint had opened the file in the first place. At 8:40 that Tuesday night, the call he made from the corner chair of my mother's hospital room wasn't to a doctor, or to check on insurance, or to ask Eric anything about her care. It was a 9-minute call to a man named Reggie Castellan, listed in the company's vendor records as a private lender, the same lender behind that $240,000 line of credit I'd found in my mother's old billing folder. My father had been managing a business debt crisis from a chair beside my dying mother's bed, lowering her safety rail to reach for something, a charger, a cup, I'll never know exactly what, and never once turning his attention back to whether it mattered. I didn't go to him with rage. I went to him with paper because paper is the only language he ever fully respected. I called Howard Pruitt and requested, as a beneficiary with standing under the trust, a formal accounting of all trust-related transactions for the preceding 18 months, citing my legal right to review fiduciary conduct. I also requested, through Diane Forsyth's office, that the hospital's completed internal review, which by then had concluded with findings naming a contributing systemic and individual factor unrelated to any caregiver named Sarah Calloway, be formally entered into the estate proceedings as evidence relevant to the negligence clause my father had invoked against me. The second family meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon, 11 weeks after the first one. Same conference room, same painting on the wall, same blinking camera, which I noticed my father still wouldn't look at. Howard opened the meeting by reading the hospital's findings aloud, plainly without commentary. I watched my father's face while he listened to his own visitor log timestamp, read back to him by a man who had drafted his trust documents for 15 years. Eric sat very still beside him, staring at a spot on the table. "There is no evidence," Howard said finally, closing the folder, "supporting application of the negligence clause against Sarah. There is, however, a separate matter the trustees and I will need to discuss privately regarding the line of credit drawn against company receivables and its disclosure, or lack thereof, to the trust's beneficiaries." My father didn't yell. I think part of me expected him to, the way you expect a storm after a long stretch of heat. Instead, he went very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when a person realizes the room has already decided something without them. "I was trying to protect this family," he said, to no one in particular. "I was trying to protect what your mother built." "She didn't build a hidden loan," I said. She built me asking the right questions. You said it yourself, at the kitchen table before she got sick. Remember? He didn't answer that. I don't think he had an answer that didn't make things worse for him. I didn't ask for an apology that day, and I didn't get one, not really. Not the kind that means anything. What I got instead was simpler, and in its own way more satisfying. Howard released my full share of the trust within 3 weeks, the negligence clause formally struck from any further application. The hospital separately updated its fall precaution protocol to require any rail adjustment by a visitor to be logged and reported to nursing staff before the visitor leaves. A small, quiet change that Karen Voss told me, almost as an aside, came directly out of the file with my mother's name on it. My father's outstanding debt to Reggie Castellan became a matter for the company's board and its own attorneys. A conversation I wasn't in the room for and didn't ask to be. Eric called me again, about a month after that second meeting. This time his voice wasn't thick with grief. It was just tired. I should have asked more questions, he said. I just believed him because it was easier. I know, I told him. It usually is. We talk now, Eric and I, not often but more honestly than we used to. My father and I don't talk much at all. I went to see him once, in late autumn, at the house where I grew up, mostly because some part of me still wanted to understand why he'd done it, whether it was fear or pride, or just the panic of a man who'd never once in his life imagined being the one who got something wrong. He didn't have a clean answer. He said something about not wanting to be the reason, about needing someone else's name on it besides his own. I think that was as close to honesty as he had in him that day. I didn't forgive him on the spot, and I'm not going to pretend this story ends with a hug in a doorway and swelling music. What I did instead was simpler. I told him I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't available anymore. Not for late-night calls asking me to drop things to make his life easier, not for a relationship built on whoever he needed me to be that week. I set the boundary calmly, the same way I'd built the case against him, one clear sentence at a time, and I meant every word of it. It's been a year now since the second meeting in that conference room. I started my own small accounting practice in the spring, the kind that specializes somewhat pointedly in forensic reviews for family trusts and estates. My mother would have found that funny, I think, in the gentle way she found most things about me funny, not laughing at me, just delighted that I'd turned my stubborn habit of reading every page into something that actually mattered. I kept that old photo album, the one Connie never opened. It sits on my own bookshelf now, and every so often I take it down and find the picture of my mother and me at my college graduation, the one she drove 4 hours alone to attend. I used to think the lesson of that whole year was about my father, about what he did and why. I don't think that anymore. The real lesson was about her, about the quiet, deliberate way she'd spent my whole life teaching me to ask the right questions, long before she ever needed me to ask them on her behalf. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this. The people who are quickest to assign blame are sometimes the ones with the most to lose if anyone looks too closely. You don't have to shout to be believed. Sometimes you just have to keep your receipts, ask your questions quietly, and wait for the paperwork to catch up to the truth. Has someone in your life ever tried to blame you for something they were actually responsible for? I'd really like to know how you handled it. Tell me in the comments.